For decades, Hollywood sold us a carefully constructed fantasy. The stars we worshipped weren't just beautiful, they were sophisticated, worldly, brilliant. The reality behind the velvet curtain tells a very different story. Some of the most iconic names in cinema history were so catastrophically confused about basic facts that studios built entire systems around hiding their intellectual limitations. Former publicists, directors, and crew members have shared stories that shatter our romantic notions of golden age glamour, revealing stars who thought continents were countries, leading men who couldn't distinguish left from right without colored tape on their shoes, and actresses who needed geography lessons just to understand where they were filming. This wasn't occasional confusion or simple mistakes. These were patterns so consistent that Hollywood developed elaborate workarounds just to get through a single day of filming. What makes these revelations particularly fascinating is the sheer disconnect between the polished images projected on screen and the reality behind the scenes. Jane Mansfield embodied this contradiction perfectly. Marketed as both bombshell and intellectual, her publicity machine worked overtime promoting her supposed genius-level IQ of 163, her ability to speak 5 languages, and her pursuit of advanced degrees. Photographers captured her reading philosophy books in bubble baths, creating an image of beauty paired with brains. The truth, according to those who worked closely with her, was far different. A makeup artist who spent considerable time with Mansfield recalled her seriously asking why California couldn't simply be moved closer to New York to reduce travel time. During a European press tour, she allegedly asked a British journalist if Europe experienced summer or remained perpetually under England weather, following up by asking if Paris was where all the British people lived. Her confusion wasn't an act she could turn on and off. It was her actual understanding of the world. One director became so frustrated that he developed a color-coded system, telling her this is a blue scene when he needed sadness or a red scene for anger. Anything more nuanced proved beyond her grasp. Her fascination with Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan created public relations nightmares because she genuinely couldn't understand why the association might damage her image, insisting that since devils weren't real, how could it matter? Perhaps most telling was her vulnerability to manipulation. Directors would offer nonsensical compliments, like praising her transcendent perpendicular energy, just to see her proudly repeat these meaningless phrases all day. Despite overwhelming evidence, Mansfield clung to believing she was intellectually gifted, insisting her confusion was merely part of her sex symbol persona. But those who knew her recognized the sad truth in watching her try to participate in serious conversations with memorized intellectual phrases deployed at completely inappropriate moments. If Mansfield at least attempted to appear intelligent, Sonny Tufts embraced becoming Hollywood's most reliable disaster. Born into a prominent Boston banking family, educated at Yale, blessed with classic leading man looks, Tufts should have been a major star. Instead, his name became literal shorthand for incompetence, with Bob Hope and Jack Benny using him as the punchline in jokes about stupidity and drunken mishaps. A Paramount production manager described him as a perfect storm of stupidity and alcohol, recalling how he once arrived at completely the wrong movie set and argued he must be the star based solely on his appearance. During a war bonds tour, he couldn't comprehend why appearances needed to happen before noon, suggesting the military simply schedule events later when people are actually awake. His drinking transformed simple confusion into spectacular catastrophes. The most infamous incident involved a charity event where an intoxicated Tufts wandered away and was later discovered unconscious in a children's petting zoo with alarmed rabbits hopping across his body. Upon waking, he tried convincing the zookeeper he was supposed to be judging the animals for a December contest, despite it being a completely different month and time of day. Paramount eventually did something unprecedented. They began issuing press releases apologizing for his very existence. After one particularly disastrous appearance where Tufts showed up drunk and made inappropriate comments, the studio released a statement clarifying that his views didn't reflect theirs. Directors developed extreme workarounds, having him deliver single lines individually rather than complete scenes, treating him like an uncooperative child who happened to be 6'4" and smelled like a distillery. Mamie Van Doren represented another variation on this theme, part of the studio system's desperate search for the next Marilyn Monroe. Van Doren possessed the requisite platinum blonde hair and impressive curves, but every unscripted interview sent publicity departments into panic mode. A Universal publicist recalled having someone stand off camera making frantic gestures whenever she started going off the rails, which typically happened within 30 seconds of any conversation beginning. Her grasp of history became legendary among Hollywood insiders. During a war film press junket in the 1950s, she allegedly told a reporter she thought World War II occurred sometime in the 1970s. When gently corrected with the observation that this would be impossible since they were currently in the 50s, Van Doren looked confused and asked if he was sure. The problem extended beyond getting facts wrong. She would argue passionately about completely incorrect information. She once insisted Abraham Lincoln invented the telephone, and when someone mentioned Alexander Graham Bell, she identified him as that guy who rang the Liberty Bell for freedom. Directors carefully scripted every public appearance, reducing her participation to saying as little as possible beyond her name and film title. For one press tour, handlers literally had her memorize 5 approved responses that she would steer toward regardless of what questions were asked. Her autobiography, published years later, became a document of chronological impossibilities and historical events rearranged in ways that defied reality, describing meetings with people who had died before she claimed to meet them, and placing herself at events that occurred before her birth. Tony Curtis brought yet another dimension to Hollywood's intellectual challenges. With dark good looks and undeniable charm, Curtis became massively bankable through films like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus. What audiences never knew was that directors and co-stars constantly scrambled to compensate for his limitations. One director who worked with Curtis multiple times admitted that while he was gorgeous and charismatic, explaining anything abstract proved futile, recalling Curtis asking if Shakespeare was the guy who wrote Dracula. His famous description of acting as just talking loud with style wasn't modest simplification. That genuinely reflected his understanding of the craft. A co-star explained that Curtis believed the louder he said something, the more dramatic it became, with concepts like subtext or character motivation completely beyond his grasp. During Spartacus, Stanley Kubrick reportedly spent hours breaking down dialogue line by line, explaining words most adults would understand without difficulty. Kubrick's legendary perfectionism was tested to breaking point, as Curtis repeatedly suggested just saying lines louder since that always works. His confusion about literature extended to suggesting that writers of major classic works didn't really know how to tell good stories. During preparations for a classical theater project, after weeks of attempting to help Curtis understand basic line meanings, he suggested translating Shakespeare into normal English, genuinely unable to comprehend why that would defeat the purpose. Tab Hunter represented the ultimate triumph of image management over substance. Warner Brothers' strategy was simple: keep him pretty, keep him singing, keep him from speaking unscripted words. With blonde hair, blue eyes, and chiseled features, Hunter became a massive teen idol through carefully controlled publicity. Behind this image was someone so limited that basic film concepts required continual re-explanation, sometimes mid-shoot. A frustrated director recalled Hunter being unable to remember blocking from one take to the next, walking in completely wrong directions despite perfect rehearsals. Production crews developed elaborate systems with tape marks on floors and frantic off-camera gesturing. A cinematographer described never seeing anything like it on professional sets, with hand signals for every action, pointing left to indicate walk left, tugging ears to signal line delivery, tapping noses to prompt looking at co-stars. Despite having relatively simple dialogue, Hunter struggled with correct order and appropriate emphasis, memorizing words as individual units disconnected from meaning. During press tours, publicists created detailed cheat sheets with film titles, character names, and plot summaries, because Hunter frequently couldn't remember basic details about movies he was actively promoting. One reporter asking about character motivation left Hunter completely blank before he asked which movie they were discussing, despite being on tour for it just 3 weeks after filming concluded. George Raft's story illustrates a different type of Hollywood stupidity, the catastrophic inability to recognize quality material when presented with it. While other stars struggled with basic comprehension or memory, Raft possessed an almost supernatural talent for making the worst possible career decisions. The list of iconic roles he rejected reads like a greatest hits of cinema history. He turned down Rick Blaine in Casablanca, Sam Spade in The Maltese Falcon, and Roy Earle in High Sierra, all parts that went to Humphrey Bogart and helped establish him as a legend. A Warner Brothers executive from that era described Raft as having the worst instincts in Hollywood, noting that this went beyond occasional misjudgment into a perfect anti-talent for recognizing quality. Raft's rejections followed specific patterns that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of compelling cinema. He refused roles where his character died, displayed notable flaws, or appeared weak or vulnerable. A studio casting director recalled Raft insisting he didn't understand the appeal of playing complicated men, wanting only to be the tough guy who wins. When offered Casablanca, Raft complained that Rick Blaine was too vulnerable and talks more than acts, completely missing that the internal struggle was exactly what made the character compelling. A story editor remembered Raft telling producers that the character spends the whole movie moping about some dame and talking about feelings. His poor judgment extended to basic business sense, consistently choosing lower-paying roles in B-movies over better-compensated parts in A-list productions, simply because the B-movie characters matched his narrow criteria. An agent familiar with star contracts from that period noted Raft literally left millions on the table, taking $30,000 to play one-dimensional gangsters in forgettable films, rather than $150,000 for complex leading roles in obvious classics. Directors who worked with Raft observed that his limitations extended to performance itself, struggling to understand motivations beyond surface-level objectives. One director explained that if you told Raft his character wants to get the money, he could play that, but adding that the character wants money because it represents freedom from his past would leave him looking like you were speaking Martian. Linda Darnell's challenges were perhaps the most poignant because they stemmed from what appeared to be a specific learning difficulty, rather than general intellectual limitation. In the 1940s, her exquisite beauty made her one of 20th Century Fox's most valuable assets, starring opposite cinema's biggest leading men. What audiences never suspected was that Darnell struggled with reading and processing written material, making every shooting day potentially disastrous. A director who worked with her multiple times recalled that script readings were agony for everyone involved, with Darnell stumbling over words, losing her place, or completely misinterpreting line meanings. While never formally diagnosed, her struggles appeared consistent with what might today be recognized as dyslexia, though studios in that era had neither understanding nor patience for such conditions. Directors essentially spoon-fed her every line, reading with intended inflection and emotion before having Darnell repeat it back, sometimes multiple times. A script supervisor described it as more like programming a machine than directing an actress. This process made filming extraordinarily time-consuming and frustrating. A cameraman recalled an unspoken understanding on her sets that everyone knew to build in extra time, with a page of script that should take an hour, potentially requiring an entire day. Rather than acknowledging these challenges, Darnell developed avoidance strategies, becoming known for suggesting scene changes that would reduce her dialogue or replace spoken lines with physical actions. A screenwriter who worked on several of her projects remembered Darnell reading scenes and immediately asking if she really needed to say all this, or couldn't she just look concerned instead. Initially, writers thought she was being difficult or lazy, but eventually most realized she was working around a genuine limitation. This struggle extended beyond film sets into her personal life, with friends reporting she rarely read books, newspapers, or even correspondence, preferring others to summarize information. A publicist recalled Darnell telling a magazine interviewer that she doesn't read books, she watches them on planes, with the reporter thinking she was joking about movie adaptations, while those who knew her understood complete seriousness. John Derek represented perhaps the most intellectually bankrupt approach to filmmaking in Hollywood history. Beginning as a reasonably successful actor known primarily for good looks rather than performance depth, Derek became famous through marriages to a succession of beautiful women, culminating with Bo Derek, whom he married when she was 19 and he was 49. After transitioning to directing, Derek created work so void of substance that it stands as a monument to prioritizing physical beauty over every other aspect of cinema. A cinematographer who worked briefly with Derek before quitting in frustration stated that he didn't direct movies so much as photograph beautiful women standing in exotic locations, literally not caring if scenes made sense, if dialogue sounded natural, or if stories held together as long as Bo looked good in the frame. When directing Tarzan the Ape Man, he reportedly told the production designer that sets didn't matter because nobody is looking at the background when Bo is in the shot. During script development for another film, when a writer attempted discussing character motivation, Derek allegedly responded with complete seriousness that his wife's body is enough and dialogue gets in the way. A gaffer who worked on a Derek production remembered him saying that lighting was exclusively for skin tone, not for mood, atmosphere, or storytelling, unable to understand why anyone would use lighting techniques to enhance emotion when they could just make sure Bo's body was well illuminated. Derek's intellectual limitations became most apparent during editing sessions where his inability to grasp narrative coherence resulted in films bordering on incoherent. An editor who worked with Derek once and refused further projects recalled him choosing takes based solely on which made Bo look most beautiful, regardless of whether performances worked or connected logically to surrounding scenes. When the editor tried explaining that a certain sequence didn't make sense, Derek stared blankly and said, "But look at her legs in that shot." After receiving devastating reviews for Tarzan the Ape Man, Derek reportedly expressed genuine confusion, telling an associate that Bo was nearly naked for half the movie, so what more could critics possibly want? What makes this entire phenomenon particularly thought-provoking is how the studio system successfully manufactured and maintained star images completely disconnected from reality. These weren't occasional lapses or moments of confusion. They were fundamental limitations that required constant management, creative workarounds, and sometimes complete restructuring of productions. Yet audiences remained completely unaware, testament to Hollywood's extraordinary ability to control narratives and craft illusions. The gap between what we believed about these stars and who they actually were reveals as much about our desire to believe in manufactured perfection as it does about the stars themselves. Golden Age Hollywood proved that with sufficient resources, publicity machinery, and determination, even the most significant limitations could be hidden behind glamour and carefully managed public appearances, creating legends that endured for decades despite having remarkably fragile foundations. The industry developed an entire infrastructure designed to protect these carefully crafted images. From publicists who wrote witty quotes for stars to repeat in interviews to handlers who guided them through public appearances with detailed cheat sheets, to directors who developed color-coded emotional systems and elaborate hand signal communications just to complete basic scenes. This massive investment in maintaining illusions speaks to how valuable these stars were commercially, despite their limitations making them extraordinarily difficult and expensive to work with on a practical level.